Right, this session is going to be on RST3B, body, soul and personal identity, and the first thing I'm going to look at is the nature and existence of the soul. Now, the soul is kind of commonly defined as a kind of incorporeal essence of a person. Now, the problem with that definition is that it is something non-scientific and therefore arguably something non-provable through science. Therefore, philosophers like Richard Dawkins are going to not have any time for the soul because it exists or is at least defined as something outside the parameters of modern science and hard materialism. However, to counter that, religious believers accept that the soul is something non-physical, intangible, incorporeal, that means without physical form. And therefore they don't see that as a problem and say, yes, this is something outside of science. That's why it has this kind of spiritual aspect attached to it. So just because by definition the soul is something non-scientific, religious believers don't see this as a problem, but actually see it as the essence of understanding what it is and perhaps how it differs from the body. Now, you also have to look at what the relationship is between the body and the soul, and why that relationship is so significant is because the soul is something non-physical and the body is something physical. Now, it's important for you to kind of revise and be ready to explain how the different theories, the different scholars and different religions talk about the relationship. And that's a really key word, relationship. It's on the specification, relationship, and therefore any word that's on the specification is deliberately there. So you need to have a kind of line in relation to relationship for each scholar, theory and religion. Dualists believe that the kind of body-soul relationship is a kind of dualistic one. So they argue that actually the body and soul are part of the same person, but are in fact distinct, and therefore they can be separated in some way. Descartes said with his argument from indivisibility that actually the body and soul have different properties. The body can be divided, the soul is not divided, it's indivisible. And therefore, because the two things have different properties, they cannot be identical. This is something called Leibniz's law. And because these two things have different properties, Descartes says they are distinct, hence dualism. So, the relationship and how different scholars view it, that's really important. For example, Richard Dawkins says the relationship is a kind of non-entity. There isn't a relationship because everything's physical. There's no real distinction between body and soul. In fact, the soul is a kind of made-up concept, really, to kind of deal with different kind of psychological needs we had or have. And this is kind of traced back to Freud. Freud says that the soul is a kind of human construct made up to explain away death anxiety, to give us hope that life is not the end, and that God loves us, the perfect father figure, etc., etc. Gilbert Ryle famously said that the body and soul kind of dichotomy is actually a false dichotomy, that actually to think of the soul or the mind as some substance in the same way that a body is a substance is to make a category mistake. And therefore this relationship is a kind of pseudo one. So you have to prepare some kind of essay on whether the notion of the soul is coherent. I mean, that's something that the spec specifically words. Is the notion of soul coherent, and are there reasonable grounds for belief in the existence of a soul? Now, whether the soul is coherent is a slightly different question or a slightly different answer to are there reasonable grounds for belief in the soul. You might conclude, for example, that the soul cannot be proven in any kind of tangible sense, but yet it's still reasonable to believe so. Because reasonable is not a kind of binary yes, no, it is or it isn't, but it's like probable, likely. So that might be a kind of compromise that some people come to in terms of their kind of conclusion on the notion of the soul. But do have an essay prepared for the notion of soul. You can have a look at my notes. for kind of inspiration. And the kind of one more kind of thing that I'll talk about in terms of the soul, although it's not in the spec, is something called Thomas Nagel's concept of qualia. Now, qualia is something in philosophy that denotes the kind of subjective character of experience. And by that I mean what it feels like to experience the world. Now, what it feels like for me, for Tony, to drink a cup of coffee is something uniquely subjective to me. And therefore science can never really account or prove or demonstrate this feeling of what it's like to be me. And because there's something about the person that cannot be demonstrated through hard science, through hard materialism, it shows that there's something non-physical that's fundamentally part of the person. Now that opens quite a lot of interesting doors about proving the existence of the soul as something non-physical. So, although it's not in the specification, Thomas Nagel's paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat, check it out on SharePoint, is quite an interesting one to use as potentially evidence to support belief in a soul. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about on soul at the moment. So, thanks very much.